From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show. On today's edition, crime and punishment. Well, you know, everybody's concerned about Chicago's street crime problem, despite the hard evidence that crime is in just about every category is going down in Chicago. The grisly gun mayhem that we're exposed to every single day is freaking out citizens and politicians alike. And of course, everybody wants answers to the question. So one of the most accessible tools in the legislative toolbox is prison. Just sweep them off the streets and lock them up, right? Well, as we saw years ago after the drug war of the 1980s, there are unintended consequences when you just throw everybody behind bars, because the ones who stay there are usually the ones who don't have the money or the resources or the strong family ties. So are we destined to continue making the same mistakes? Well, Angela Caputo has written some compelling stuff in the latest Chicago Reporter about a Chicago Police Department practice that has been referred to as sweeping the streets or rounding up the usual suspects. And Pulitzer Prize-winning Sun-Times reporter Frank Main is back with us again. Frank has written for years about the challenge of trying to reduce street crime, especially when even the victims don't want to cooperate after they themselves have been shot. And so we thought we'd bring both of these great writers and good thinkers to the show again today. Glad to have you both with us today. And in particular, to maybe begin our conversation in Springfield, because as we are recording this program right now, they're probably talking about it in Springfield and trying to figure out how to get to this thing that Superintendent McCarthy wants and the mayor wants, for mandatory minimums, increased mandatory minimums if you happen to possess a firearm when you get arrested. And it has been very interesting to watch this, because it's the first time in my memory where something like that has had pushback, and that pushback has been getting increasingly vocal to the point that they've had to water down the bill, right? So what are we seeing?
I think it's been really fascinating to watch. So I think the start of all of this was probably with McCarthy and Rahm Emanuel. New York raised its mandatory minimums probably 5-6 years ago. I don't know the exact date. And Superintendent McCarthy used to be a top cop in New York, and he says that was one of the key reasons for their great success in bringing down crime in New York. So they wanted to do the same thing in Chicago, and essentially they wanted to raise the mandatory minimum prison sentence from 1 to 3 years in Chicago. So almost immediately you had pushback, like you said, from people who said, look, we're warehousing so many people in prison. Do we need 20,000 more people in Illinois' prisons? It's going to cost an extra $1 billion to do that. And so what happened next is you had all of these unusual alliances and positions on this issue developing, in not only in academia but even the NRA. So
yeah, I'll say. I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just found that fascinating that you see like the John Howard Association and the National Rifle Association on the same side.
Right, almost. I mean,
almost.
So what the NRA said was, well, you know what? This is an issue where we always say that you should be enforcing the existing gun laws, and if you have somebody who is illegally possessing a weapon, we're for you busting that person and sending them to prison. But we don't want your little old lady down the street who had her husband's gun in her house and she goes out with it for some reason and gets busted and she goes to prison for 3 years, which I think is a little bit far-fetched. I don't think prosecutors would actually charge that person. But the NRA says we don't trust the prosecutors to do that. So they said, look, we don't care about this. We support this issue as long as you take the first offenders out of it. So that was their position. University of Chicago, on one side of the issue, supports this, or at least presented evidence that seems to back the use of these mandatory minimums. They say that violent felons gun possessors are 4 times more likely to commit violent felonies than your regular prison population. On the other side of it, you have Northwestern University, and their law clinic is saying, there's no empirical evidence that locking up these people for 2 more years is going to do anything more to reduce crime. So that's the landscape right here.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to, piggyback on what you're saying, research has shown, and some of the debate has been that, New York's crime numbers have gone down, but they started going down before the mandatory minimums were enacted. So people feel that that's been spun. I think the other thing is, this $1 billion investment. We have to build an additional prison to warehouse these people. And if you've been into prison, you know that people are languishing in prisons doing nothing. And so the question is, how can we better spend it? Or the question is there a way that we could spend this $1 billion that could be far more effective at fighting crime? Yeah. Could you take people who are marginalized or, on the fringe and, somehow, I think a job is a great deterrent. Could a good job be a better deterrent than, 3 years in the penitentiary? So, and then of course there's also the racial division within the city council. When it was debated, it came down along racial lines. Sure did. Because one alderman said, we're tired of having Class X shoved down our throats. We know who's going to go to prison for this, and
you're gonna lock up more of our population.
And their point is that people have guns for all different sorts of reasons. And so this bill will sweep people into prison who are not the, that stereotypical gangbanger that, the law is really created.
Well, I mean, there are so many aspects to this that I know we could probably spend the whole show just talking about that. But there are things that just really stand out to me. Like now the NRA is saying, and I guess there is agreement on this, that, okay, we'll apply this if it's your second offense and if you're a gang member. And the immediate response I had to that was, what is the legal definition of a gang member? I mean, this is a law that we're writing here. The police department claims almost everybody they arrest is a gang member.
You have insight. Is that you have a contact card? Is that what that means?
No, they've already done this in the Valadez law. That was a law that was created after a police officer was murdered by a gang member, and Anita Alvarez, the state's attorney, pushed it. And they said essentially, if you're a gang member who commits a violent gun crime, you're going to get additional penalties. And so what they do is they look at self-admissions, and what happens a lot of times is a gang member goes to jail, and he will tell the intake people, I am a Latin King or I am a gangster disciple. And the reason is self-protection. He wants to associate with people who are not going to kill him. So they use that as the basis for their database, which then, and they also have other intelligence, I guess, that they use. But that was my initial question on the Valadez law. How are you going to be able to survive challenges to this from people saying I'm not associated with a gang? And I think they have made some successful Valadez cases. So, but again, I mean, the use of that law is pretty limited. I mean, if you're making this a much broader law, you may start having problems with it.
I do want to just dwell on this for a moment longer because of this issue that, as I mentioned earlier, it's sort of like the toolbox has only one tool in it. It really feels like that sometimes. It's like it's very easy for politicians and police superintendents to stir up the population and say, here's this is the problem. We've got this problem. We have to get these people off the streets. And it's hard to argue against it. And you see this weird triad that's kind of developing here of the prosecutors and the judges and the police. And neither of them are responsible when the other does something. If the police says we want to get more people in prison, then you get DART saying, oh, we're overcrowded, but the judges say, well, that's not our problem. We don't determine how many people get arrested, and the prosecutors say we're not going to let somebody off who we think might commit a crime later on because then Anita Alvarez won't get reelected.
So none of these they're not playing well in the sandbox together, none of these parties. And Preckwinkle's office, the county president, has been trying to get them to do that. And to this point, I don't think it's worked. I think the chief judge says essentially, it's not our responsibility to make sure that the jail is not overcrowded. It's,
Yeah,
that's not our problem.
Yeah.
These mandatory minimums, though, I mean, they keep resurfacing. So a few years back, we passed a mandatory 1-year minimum for selling heroin, and I mean, we see what that's really done to the heroin trade on the west side.
Yeah,
Not that much. It's like poke-a-mole. That's what police tell me. You knock one guy out, and there's another guy that's there the next day ready to
because the demand, you haven't done anything to eliminate the demand, so there'll always be somebody willing to take the risk to sell it.
It's the same thing, though. It's like this, just like with this mandatory minimum, which isn't new. I mean, there are new mandatory gun minimums that have become law over the past 3-4 years. This bill that Zalewski's floating on behalf of the state's attorney and the mayor and the police department, he tried already to float this, and there have been other iterations of this that he's tried in the past couple of years. So, I mean, these keep coming back, but it's always the thing that's really different about this time is that it's this really emotional issue. You have Hydea Pendleton's mother, up at a podium saying, if this law were here, my daughter would be alive
would
today.
still be alive today.
And it's just like the heroin drug trade with these kids from the suburbs who are dying.
I think there's just one other point, and the people who are essentially criticizing judges for not being harder on folks who are caught with illegal weapons, and it's the judges, and I've talked to some of them, believe that possessory gun crimes are not violent crimes, and you have a whole element. The police department, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, which has done these analyses, Rahm Emanuel believe possessory gun crimes are violent crimes because you're very likely to use that gun, and so. I think there should be a big debate about whether possessory gun offenses and possessory drug offenses should be on the same level, and should we be locking up all these druggies in prison when you might have more people who are more prone to violence who are not getting the same treatment because of mandatory minimums?
The thing that really bugs me about this is that I have this feeling that we're just creeping further and further away from the Constitution here, that as I understand it, allows you to have your day in court, that there's a third leg to our Constitution. You got your judiciary branch. And more we seem to be saying, screw the judiciary, they take too long, they don't do the things we want them to do. We're just going to legislate that you're going to prison, and we're going to legislate what it is that you do so the judges get cut out of the deal, and I this is a one-note thing of mine, but it all to me it's all part of the same part and parcel of something that started during the Daley administration with the administrative adjudication, where you get this ticket and you're automatically guilty because a camera snapped a picture of you or a police officer wrote his name on the ticket, so therefore it's assumed that you're guilty, so just pay it. You don't really have any opportunity to press your case. Now, obviously, some of this is because these things are just open and shut cases, but somehow or other we've moved ourselves away from the judicial process, and now we're getting further away from it, so that if you just get picked up on the street and you got a gun, you may just go to prison without ever even really having your day in court, realistically.
Well, yeah, if you're facing 3 years and your case is iffy, you're likely to plead out. And what likely happens, even with these mandatory cases, is judges still have discretion if the prosecutor agrees to dismiss the most serious case, then the person might go to prison on a lesser case, and that happens a lot with other types of Class X felonies and things. Armed robberies, example. Say I get charged with armed robbery, I have to go to prison for a minimum of 6 years, no probation. Lots of times those cases get pleaded down to a simple robbery or whatever, and I think that's what would happen in lots of times if this legislation is to pass. So.
And I think that you'll get a lot fewer people who are just taking a plea deal to do a boot camp, which is now out of the question, or some sort of diversion program, and they'll start challenging the arrest. I think that we'll see a lot more. I mean, that's already happening. People are challenging gun cases.
Right.
Well, in your most recent piece in the Chicago Reporter, which we strongly recommend to people to take a look at, obviously we want you to talk about it, but the idea that people that police are essentially rounding up the usual suspects, and then they'll get them into Cook County Jail, where they'll sit for sometimes weeks as charges are they're charged, but they're not going to court. And then when they finally get their day in court, either the police don't show up or the charges are dropped, and they just say, oh, okay, you can go, after you've been sitting there for 4 weeks. So this is a way of incarcerating people without even using the judicial process, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, critics call it a wink and a nod agreement between police and the prosecutor's office. The police will make the arrest. I mean, typically you'll get, maybe a night at the station. That's the most common thing. But if you have, maybe you have a track record of not showing up to court dates for other minor offenses like selling cannabis or a prostitution charge, then they'll hold you in the county jail and you'll just wait for your case to be continued. But the stunning thing is that in the misdemeanor courts, which are really, that's the high volume courtroom, these felony courtrooms, they're, 30,000 cases compared to 200,000 cases per year. Yeah. And in these misdemeanor courtrooms, 8 out of 10 cases are thrown out. So there are very, very few people who are convicted. So we have this whole process, this whole theater, judicial theater, and in the end, nothing comes of these cases.
Because as you describe so realistically, is you have a judge who's just sitting there, and in the case of an hour, just dismisses, I don't know, scores of cases, right? They just come up one every 30 seconds. They're all being dismissed.
A lot are being dismissed, but you also see a lot of cases that are continued. So they're kicked down the road for another month, another few weeks, and then they end up dismissed. So you've got people who are, and even the length of time that it's taking in some of these cases, when you're talking about a domestic battery or you're talking about, a dispute between neighbors, the fact that you have to come to court 2 and 3 times, it becomes discouraging, and so that discourages witnesses from showing. But a bulk of these cases are for loitering, for trespass. They're the sort of crimes where police are, often the complaining witness, cannabis possession, cannabis stealing, and they're getting thrown out because police officers, it looks like police officers aren't showing up to court.
They're the complaining witness and they just don't show.
Yeah, so
So I mean, you'd have to, I don't think it's too cynical to say that this is a method that the police and the prosecutors have come up with to sort of take some people that they just don't want out there on the streets, get them off the streets without having them be sent to prison. They just keep them, they just hold them there for a while.
Well, I mean, the cops, when I talk to police officers in the court, they tell me that it's a policing strategy. They need to bring people in. They need to see what they know. I think from what I've heard from police officers who work on tactical teams and work on more serious crime is that it's frustrating. They feel like a lot of times people are picked up who just don't know anything. It's kind of the wrong people who are being picked up, and then we see they're just being let go.
And the other side of that strategy is that they try to make contact with these people to see if they have guns or drugs on them and that kind of stuff. And if they don't, but they have a warrant, they bring them in anyway. So, they might stop and frisk you on suspicion of having drugs or a weapon, and you wind up going to jail because you had a disorderly that you missed court for or something. So I think that's happening.
Well, this also kind of is all in the same realm as this long debated thing about the broken windows policies and all of the things that have come from it. And of course, our police superintendent is a student of the broken windows thing, which also originated, I believe, in New York, right, with Giuliani. The idea that you got to go after the little things because that helps you solve the big things. And it may be very effective in the short term, but in the long term, it ends up with a lot of people getting records and being held in prison and in jail.
I mean, if you Google anybody who's been arrested, you can pull up their mugshot right away, whether or not they're convicted. There is a paper trail, and this paints a character profile of people. And, it's also very discouraging, in communities of color, people who talk about how they're just really frustrated by the fact that, if the police stop you and they search you and they really don't have anything on you, then why do they have to take you to the station? They feel harassed. And these numbers suggest that these are really flimsy things that people are being picked up for. I mean, it validates that. I
think there's one issue where the police and the General Assembly, or at least, the City Council could have done more. So for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been talking about how misdemeanor marijuana arrests are just almost uniformly dismissed in court. So the argument was that it was totally counterproductive, wasn't cost efficient, and as Angela's saying, it also trails you if you have this arrest, and so they tried to make it a ticketable offense. And the truth is now that cops aren't really writing these tickets for a variety of reasons. The city council essentially made it too difficult for cops to write these tickets. They took all these different places where people are arrested off limits for writing tickets, and so I think that an administrative process would have been really helpful. That wouldn't stay on your record forever. You know, you pay your fine, you're done. So, and it would it potentially could serve to unclog the misdemeanor courts, but it's not happening.
But then on the flip side, I mean, the police superintendent, was really vocal earlier on in this conversation about cannabis arrests, and he said, this is a really important tool that we have to pick people up. We need to be able to do this.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's not a secret. I don't think police are secretive about it. I think it's, like they say, we need this. This is a tool for us.
So, where does it leave us right now? I mean, are we arresting too many people, or are we just kind of looking only at one side of the picture? Because I could certainly imagine that I wouldn't pass the exam, and I would never be able to be a police officer. But if I were, I can't imagine the insurmountable challenges that they have on the street. I mean, I certainly can be sympathetic.
Correct me, because you've been just looking at these numbers, but I think that the number of police arrests are way down as compared to 5 years ago.
Right.
I don't know what that means. It possibly could mean that there are a couple thousand fewer cops on the street than there were 5 years ago. So that's one issue. There's a whole larger issue, of course, of whether violent crime is going down in the city, or is there's certainly a perception that it's not in many neighborhoods, and so I think that's a really interesting issue: perception versus numbers.
Yeah. But the numbers are real, though, right? You buy the numbers?
I buy the numbers. So what the police department put out about a week ago is that through the end of October, every crime category, not only violent but nonviolent crime, every major category was down, most of them to 1965 levels, and lowest since 1965. The problem is, and there was a very interesting editorial in the Chicago Tribune, which used a study that a master's candidate at the University of Chicago had done. And what he did is, so if you tell me that violent crime is higher on the west side and the south side than the north side, I'm going to say duh. If you tell me that minorities are more affected, I'm going to say duh. But what this guy did, which was interesting, is that he looked at the rate of crime in neighborhoods on the south and west side and showed that the rate is actually going up compared to the north side police districts, because you've had a massive exodus of population on the south and west sides. Right. But even with that population decrease, when you do a kind of a per capita number, his study showed that those crime rates are going up. They're not uniformly going down across the city. Yeah. So the thesis that he had was, if this continues to happen, you're going to keep seeing a migration of middle class African American families out of Chatham and other neighborhoods like that, and it's going to hurt the city. So I don't know. I haven't been able to replicate what this study said yet, but that was a new take on it for me.
Yeah, we had. His name escapes me right now, but we had him on the program here, and it was it's just really fascinating to see when you look at all those graphs, and there are parts of the city where over the last 20 years they have literally, the whole north stretch of the city is a safer place to live than Toronto. But there are other places where that's not true. I really want to try to get us into a little bit of this discussion about the police overtime thing, because it's such a big question right now. I mean, $100 million spent this year on police overtime. And McCarthy just straight up said, I'm doing it because it's cheaper, right? It's cheaper for me to pay for a guy who's already on the force to work an extra, whatever it is, 10, 15 hours a week, than it is to train and put on the force a new recruit. Mm-hmm. But that raises the question, don't we need those new recruits anyway? And is this penny wise and pound foolish, or is it something even worse than that?
Well, what I see going on here is that they are they're only hiring at a high enough level to keep the department at status quo. Mm-hmm. So you have a lot of people retiring every year. They're replacing those folks with recruits. But they're not going to try to go higher than whatever the number is now, 9,600 sworn officers. I don't know what the number is. It used to be 13,200, at least that was the number they would give. Yeah. So like you said, they are looking at overtime to kind of bridge that gap. And I talked to beat cops I've known for 10 years, and they say for the first time they're making more than $105,000 a year. I mean, wow. These are guys who've been on the force for 20, 25 years and qualify for that overtime, those overtime districts. Yeah. But they love it. I mean, and they're, they're working crazy hours to do it, but, they're banking tons of money. Mm-hmm. So they like it. There's an argument that we're going to burn out all these cops.
Yeah,
They say, nah, we go to court anyway. We do court overtime. This is better. We're actually, serving the community when we're out there on the streets. So that's kind of the backdrop for it.
So what is your take, the two of you, on this overarching question of, do we need to have more police officers than we have? Do we need to have more police officers than we have?
I think you get a mixed reaction even from people who are in communities most affected by crime. On one hand, even the aldermen, they feel like the police are over-aggressive and they feel like, they're not solving crimes. But then on the flip side, they're like, where are the police?
Where are they
we
when
need
you
some
them?
backup.
I
think the bigger picture that we kind of get away from, we talk a lot about staffing and arrests and police departments. I think this perception of the crime being up is that people feel like they're worn so thin. We have some of the highest childhood poverty rates in the country in these same neighborhoods. We have more people, young people, 18 to 25, who've never had a job than any other part of the country in North Lawndale and West Englewood. Yep. Those are the things that contribute to the perception. And can we arrest our way out of this problem?
Right.
Yeah, I think crime, for a huge part of this is crimes equals jobs, and the cops can only do so much to prevent people from committing crimes. I mean, they can be on the streets where stuff is going to happen, but they can't be everywhere. What McCarthy says is that per capita, again, we have more cops in New York or LA. Now, I don't know what we're doing wrong, what LA is doing right, because their per capita murder rates are far lower than ours. Yeah. So
we're gonna have to leave it there and pick it up again another time, because it would be really interesting to get into those larger issues about, well, what is the interface between crime and jobs and the economy. But that's where we leave it today. Frank Main from the Chicago Sun-Times, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hope you'll be back again. I'm glad to have you. And of course, Angela Caputo, always welcome here, both of you. Angela Caputo from the Chicago Reporter. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. And of course, you can find us right here on cable. But you can also see us online if you just go to this address and watch us on YouTube any old time, night or day, 2 o'clock in the morning. You can watch Chicago Newsroom. What's better than that? And you can listen to the audio podcast too. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks so much. Like it or not, we're right back here again next week at the same time, same place, and I hope you'll watch. See you next week. Bye.